Well, hello again, and welcome back to Pete's Profundities and Profanities, and specifically part 2 of the blank canvas theory. You may recall that in part 1 I defined this as being a theoretical blank canvas representing a new and predominating mainstream musical form with a finite life I'd estimated to be 30 years or thereabouts. And before it was, to all intents and purposes, complete and exhausted, and then gave way to another predominant music form with its own new, virtually pristine blank canvas. Just for purposes of clarity, can I make it clear at this point that I'm talking about the predominant mainstream musical form? In saying this, I fully accept and acknowledge that there are other important genres, such as jazz, folk and country, which, though never predominant in themselves, continued to evolve and influence throughout all of these periods. In part 1, we covered music hall and vaudeville from the turn of the 19th century to approximately 1927 and the advent of talkies. And from that point on, it's being supplanted by the Great American Songbook. What I intend to do in part 2 is to identify the music form that was to replace this after what some may consider to be a false dawn. Insomuch as for a relatively brief period of time, from the mid-1950s to the very early 1960s, the new musical form, which seemed set to supplant the Great American Songbook in its predominance, was what I shall call classic rock and roll. I would, however, contend that its lifespan was too short-lived for it to be considered a legitimate and genuine successor to the Great American Songbook. And though its practitioners, such as Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and of course Elvis Presley, were undeniably important and influential, I would strongly suggest that the distinction as a genuine successor would have to wait until 1963 and the arrival, spearheaded by the Beatles in the UK and Tamla Motown in the US, of what I shall call the Beat era, with its own and virtually pristine blank canvas. Part of the reason I say this is that those artists I have previously alluded to as being representative of classic rock and roll, alongside those such as Pat Boone, Paul Anka, Bobby Vee, and the pale British imitators of American rock and roll, like Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, Marty Wilde and Billy Fury, were, to all intents and purposes, blown out of the water and made virtually redundant by the coming of the Beatles and the Beat era. With the possible exceptions of Elvis Presley and Cliff Richard, their time had effectively been and gone. As to whether the likes of Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran and Sam Cooke would have survived and flourished had they lived is, of course, something which we'll never know. The Beat era itself came to represent a very broad church of musical genres and styles, which, in addition to pop and rock, went on to encompass and include rhythm and blues, Tamla Motown, soul, reggae, progressive rock, heavy metal, folk rock, jazz rock fusion, punk rock, etc., and was to hold total sway for the next 3 decades and more. My own belief and contention is that this reached its apex between 1965 and 1975, and would strongly suggest that one only has to look at the artists who were at their absolute creative peak during this period for this to be self-evident. But again, that is something for me to cover at greater length in a future podcast. All of this time, from 1963 to, I would suggest, some point in the early to mid-1990s, the Beat era's own blank canvas was also being added to inexorably, until it too was, to all intents and purposes, complete saturated and exhausted. By this, I do not mean to say that all the great songs and albums had already been written by some indeterminate point in the 1990s, nor necessarily that the artists, songwriters and musicians were any less talented, though I do believe that there is actually some real merit to this argument. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that the scope for these artists to create something novel within this musical form had become so limited and restricted that any true originality would, by definition, become far rarer and more elusive. Even truly great artists, who I would suggest approach genius, such as Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder, would surely concede that with the best will in the world, their creative output over the past 30 years or so in no way stands comparison to that which they had produced during the aforementioned halcyon and golden age between 1965 and 1975. I would therefore politely suggest that the great majority of mainstream music produced since some indeterminate point in the 1990s has been little more than derivative, formulaic, and mediocre, with style invariably eclipsing substance, and despite, I might add, the self-serving interests and ulterior motives of the monolith that the music industry has become, desperately attempting to persuade and convince us otherwise. In conclusion, and based upon the suggested lifespan of the Blank Canvas theory, it is surely high time, and indeed decades overdue, for a new, broad and predominating musical form to emerge as a successor to the beat era. Unfortunately, from my own perspective, the nearest thing which approaches this takes the form of hip-hop and variations on this theme. If that is indeed the case, then all I can say is to echo and quote from the Beatles' Revolution, and as much as, "Don't you know that you can count me out?" This is primarily because I consider them to be the very antithesis of music as I know it, and would indeed describe them as being anti-music, with the only elements remotely listenable being the samples that they so liberally lift from great songs of the 60s, 70s and 80s. I do fully appreciate that this may leave me open to accusations from some of undue pessimism as well as rose-tinted nostalgia, and perhaps I'm guilty of both of these things. On the other hand, and you'll have to be of a certain age to appreciate this, I'm reminded of The Goon Show when Minnie Bannister responded to her erstwhile live-in partner Henry Crumbs reading out to her of an unfeasibly long and complex piano serial code with the words, "Oh, Henry, they don't write numbers like that anymore." And you know, perhaps Minnie was right. Anyway, that's about all from me for the time being, folks. I do hope that you've enjoyed to one degree or another my musings upon the Blank Canvas theory, and I will look forward to hopefully welcoming you back again for my next podcast, in which I shall endeavour to back up and substantiate my earlier claim that the period between 1965 and 1975 represented the greatest period in the history of popular music, and indeed represents its very apotheosis. Until then, thank you once more. Please take good care of you and yours, and may your God go with you. Bye for now.